She returned to Seoul searching for pieces of the past, only to discover that moving forward meant letting go of what could never be reclaimed. The city of Seoul feels different now. Jiwon couldn't quite place it. The skyline, once so familiar, seemed unfamiliar now, with its new buildings and neon lights replacing the dim streets she had known. It was early morning when she arrived, the streets quiet except for the occasional rush of wind that stirred the last of the autumn leaves from the trees. The apartment she had rented was small, but enough for the life she had now. It had been years since she left Seoul, and returning felt both necessary and unsettling. The apartment was located in a neighborhood that had always felt like a quiet refuge. Once a bustling area filled with street vendors and the sound of children's laughter, it had since become more commercialized, its charm overshadowed by high-rise apartments and cafes that catered to a new generation. It wasn't quite the place she had left, but it was close enough to hold onto memories that had long since faded. Jiwon found herself standing by the window, her fingers lightly brushing against the cool glass. The city stretched out beneath her, the endless streets weaving together like a web that connected this version of the world to the one she once knew. Her memories lingered like fragments of an old film, scenes she had once watched so closely, now distant and blurry, as though time itself had blurred them. She had left Seoul with the certainty that she was pursuing something bigger, a dream she could no longer chase while tethered to the past. But now that she was back, there was a quiet sense of disillusionment that followed her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. She had returned for a reason, though she wasn't sure what that reason was anymore. It had been years since she'd last seen the people she had once known, and in that time, everything had changed. They had moved on, found their own paths, and Jiwon was left wondering if she, too, had truly moved on, or if she had simply been drifting. Her return had been a quiet one. There were no reunions, no grand plans to visit old friends or try to rekindle lost connections. She had no expectations beyond finding a way to settle into the rhythm of life again. In the days that followed, Jiwon would wander through the streets, retracing old paths as if doing so would somehow bring clarity, some sign of who she had once been. The streets seemed almost the same busy intersections, the same vendors selling their goods. But there was a lingering sense of change. The city was faster now, more modern and less forgiving of nostalgia. The world had moved on without her, and she couldn't help but feel like a ghost passing through a life that wasn't hers anymore. The first few days in Seoul had been quiet. The silence in her apartment was thick, almost suffocating. She had spent the first morning unpacking boxes, sorting through clothes, and finding places for things she had accumulated during her years abroad. It wasn't that she hadn't expected the emptiness. It was just more overwhelming than she had anticipated. In the silence of the apartment, the world outside seemed muted, as if it had forgotten her. It was both comforting and suffocating. The realization that she was here, but also not really here. It was a strange feeling, this sense of returning home to something that no longer felt like home. Her return wasn't for anyone in particular. She had no grand plan, no one to reunite with. The people she had once been close to had their own lives now, and the spaces she had known didn't hold the same meaning they once did. Yet, she couldn't shake the sense that something was unfinished. She had come back to find closure, though she wasn't sure what she was supposed to close. So much of it felt like a dream now, a life she had lived but didn't fully remember. The morning light, the smell of coffee brewing in a nearby cafe, the sounds of traffic, these things felt like echoes, like ghosts of the past. Days passed slowly. She wandered through the streets of the city, visiting old places she used to frequent, hoping to find some comfort in their familiarity. The cafes where she had sat with friends, the small bookstore she used to visit every weekend, they were all the same, yet they felt different. She couldn't help but wonder if they had changed, or if it was she who had changed. The sight of familiar faces, now indifferent to her presence, only reinforced the feeling of estrangement. The city had outgrown her, and she was left to catch up. She often found herself thinking about Minho, the one person who had meant so much to her. He had been her closest friend, the person she had shared her thoughts with, the person who had been there when things fell apart. But now, even the thought of him seemed distant, clouded by the years of silence that had passed between them. Has he changed too? Had he moved on? She had left without looking back, thinking that the distance would be the answer, thinking that time would heal everything. But time hadn't healed anything. Instead, it had carved out a space that was now empty. The last conversation she had with him was nothing more than a memory now, faded and unclear. She remembered leaving, promising she would return, telling him that the time apart wouldn't matter. But now, in the quiet of the city, she couldn't remember why she had made those promises. What did they mean? Did he believe them? Did she? It was easy to convince herself that there would always be time to come back, to make things right. But the years had passed, and in that time, everything had changed. She had moved away to pursue something, anything, that would take her away from this place, this life. But it wasn't the escape she had imagined. It had only made her realize that she had left behind more than she had thought. And now, with every passing day, that realization seemed harder and harder to bear. Her thoughts often returned to the park near the Han River. It was the place they had spent so many afternoons together, walking along the water, talking about their hopes and dreams, about the future they imagined. The park had always felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could exist outside the constraints of the world, a place where time seemed to slow down. But now, when she thought of the park, it felt different. The trees no longer offered the same shade, and the bench where they had sat now felt too far away. The memory of their laughter, the way they had spoken in soft tones, seemed to slip through her fingers whenever she tried to grasp it. She had hoped that returning to the park would bring back some of those feelings, some of that peace, but it hadn't. Instead, the park had become a reminder that some things were simply lost to time. One afternoon, after several days of walking the streets aimlessly, Jiwon found herself standing at the edge of the park by the river. The familiar path along the water had not changed, but the feeling of walking it alone was something she hadn't anticipated. The river, once comforting, now felt cold and indifferent. The sound of the water lapping at the shore was drowned by the silence in her mind. She stood there for a long time, lost in thought, unsure of what she was hoping to find. The past was gone. The promises they had made were lost to time. She had come to realize that returning to Seoul had not brought the closure she had expected. The city was different, and so was she. The places she had visited, the familiar faces she had hoped to see again, they all seemed distant, like fragments of a dream. It was as if the city had moved on without her, and in doing so had left her behind. As the days continued to pass, Jiwon began to withdraw more into herself. She visited the park by the river a few more times, each time feeling the weight of the memories settle on her shoulders. The world around her moved forward, but she was stuck in a moment, trying to piece together the fragments of a life that no longer fit together. The apartment was quiet again that evening. Jiwon had gotten into the habit of walking to the store for groceries each evening, something to fill the silence. She didn't need much, just enough to get by. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had tried to fill the emptiness with routines, with the things she thought would bring her comfort, but nothing seemed to work. The days blurred together. The apartment was empty, save for the occasional sound of passing cars or distant voices from the street below. Jiwon sat by the window for hours, watching the world unfold outside. She had always been one to enjoy the quiet, but now it felt more like a reminder of what she no longer had. It was easy to pretend that she was content, that everything was fine. But in the stillness of the apartment, she knew that it wasn't. The evenings spent alone in her apartment felt like the longest part of the day. There was no one to talk to, nothing to fill the silence. She had gotten used to the quiet during her time abroad, but now it felt more oppressive. Sometimes she would pick up a book, but the words on the page never seemed to hold her attention. The stories once so engaging felt distant and unimportant now. There was no escape in them, no comfort to be found. It was a little over a week before she ventured out again, this time with no particular destination in mind. The streets were busy, the usual rush of people walking with purpose. She couldn't help but feel out of place, as though she didn't belong among them. The city seemed like a foreign land, its rhythm unfamiliar and distant. She passed by the small cafe where she had spent so many afternoons with Minho, but the moment she caught sight of it, she quickly turned away. The memories of those days were too vivid, and she wasn't sure if she could face them again. She walked aimlessly, her mind drifting in and out of thoughts. She had wanted to return to Seoul to reconnect with her past, but the more she walked, the more she realized how much had changed. Not just the city, but herself. She had become someone different, someone who no longer knew how to belong. The city of Seoul continued to pulse with life around Jiwon, but she felt more like a spectator than a participant. The days passed, each blending into the next, with little distinction between them. The fleeting memories of her past life hung over her like a fog, and the longer she stayed, the more she realized how deeply the distance had stretched between her and the person she had once been. The park by the river called to her more than once, its quiet solitude offering a temporary escape from the relentless city noise. The water glimmered in the fading light of the late afternoons, and the wind, which carried the scent of earth and trees, whispered reminders of times that had passed. Each visit felt like a return to a memory she couldn't quite reach, a recollection of who she was before the years of silence, before the long stretches of time that had divided her from the life she once lived. One afternoon, she found herself back in the park again. It had been several weeks since her arrival in Seoul, and she had become accustomed to the silence in her apartment. The world outside had a rhythm that felt alien to her now, and despite the occasional encounter with old acquaintances, Jiwon remained isolated, locked in a private world of reflection. Her footsteps echoed softly against the path as she walked toward the bench where she and Minho had spent countless afternoons. She hesitated, as though fearing to disturb the fragile memory that seemed to settle around the place. The bench was still there, weathered and worn, a quiet observer to the passage of time. She sat down, her hands resting lightly on her knees, and closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the sounds of the river and the distant hum of the city to fill the space around her. The weight of it all pressed down on her, so many years of separation, of silence, of promises made and unkept. It was as if the past had grown too heavy for her to carry, its burden too great to bear. She thought of Minho again, of the time they had shared, and how it had slipped away as easily as sand through her fingers. They had been so close once, so connected, but time had slowly eroded that bond, and she was left here, in the shadow of their former selves. Jiwon's mind wandered back to the day she left Seoul. The decision to leave had been difficult, but in the end, she had convinced herself it was the right one. She had believed that her future lay elsewhere, that she could find something more than what the city could offer her. But now, in the quiet park, she understood the cost of that choice. The distance between her and everything she had known was no longer just physical, it was emotional, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. She had returned to find closure, but the closer she came to her past, the more it seemed to slip further away. Her attempts to reconnect with old friends, to find a place where she belonged, felt increasingly futile. She was no longer part of the life she had left behind, and though she had hoped to reclaim something, the reality was that everything had moved forward without her. The days turned into weeks, and Jiwon continued to wander through the city, trying to find a way to make peace with her past. But each day felt like a battle, an internal struggle to reconcile the person she had been with the person she was becoming. The city had become a reminder of what she had lost, and the more she tried to grasp it, the more it seemed to slip from her. It was on one of these long walks, as the last light of the day faded into the cool embrace of evening, that she saw him. Minho. His figure was just a shadow at first, but as he stepped closer, her heart caught in her chest. He was standing there across the street, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. It had been so long, years. The lines on his face had deepened, and his posture was more rigid, as though life had placed its weight on his shoulders in ways she hadn't expected. He looked older, more worn, but there was something in his eyes, something familiar yet distant, that caused her heart to ache. For a long moment, they simply stood there, separated by the distance of a street and the years that had passed between them. Jiwon's hands trembled, and she wasn't sure what to do, whether to step forward or remain frozen in place. She wanted to call out his name, to bridge the gap between them, but the words caught in her throat. Minho took a step forward, as if sensing the distance between them. He stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable. And in that brief moment, Jiwon saw a flicker of something. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just the remnants of the bond they had once shared. But it was fleeting, and as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by the silence that had defined their relationship for years. "I didn't expect you to come back," Minho said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Jiwon struggled to find her voice, her thoughts tangled and incomplete. She had wanted this, hadn't she? To find him, to speak to him, to finally understand what had happened between them. But now that he was here, standing in front of her, the words she had rehearsed in her mind all seemed meaningless. She had wanted closure, but now she wasn't sure what that even meant. Was it the past that needed to be laid to rest, or was it the future that had never had a chance to begin? They stood there for what seemed like an eternity, the sound of the city fading around them. It was strange how they could be so close and yet so far apart. The weight of the years pressed in on them, unspoken and suffocating. They had both changed, had both lived lives that the other hadn't been a part of. And in that silence, Jiwon realized that the distance between them was not something that could be bridged so easily. The years had created too wide a gap, one that couldn't be filled with words or apologies. With a final lingering glance, Minho turned and walked away. Jiwon stood frozen for a moment, her eyes following his retreating figure, before she slowly turned back to the park. The weight of the moment settled on her, and the silence that enveloped her seemed more profound than it ever had before. She returned to the apartment that evening, the familiar emptiness of it greeting her like an old friend. The city outside continued to pulse with life, but inside her, there was only stillness. The words they had shared, the fleeting connection they had tried to revive, it all seemed so small now. What was left for her here? She had returned with the hope of finding something, but now she realized that some things were never meant to be reclaimed. Days passed, but they felt different now, each one heavier than the last, as if the weight of her return had finally settled into her bones. Jiwon no longer walked the streets aimlessly, no longer searched for meaning in the places that had once held significance. Instead, she stayed in her apartment, her thoughts drifting in and out of focus. She didn't hear from Minho again, and she didn't reach out. The silence between them stretched on, a quiet reminder that some things were better left in the past. The city of Seoul, once so full of possibilities, now felt like a cage, and Jiwon couldn't help but wonder if she had returned only to realize that her future no longer lay here. It was a few weeks later, under a sky heavy with rain, that Jiwon received a call. It was from Minho's family. He had been found in his apartment, a life snuffed out too soon, leaving only the questions of what had happened and why. Jiwon stood by the window, staring out at the rain as it poured down in sheets. She didn't cry, she didn't know what to feel. The silence, once her companion, now felt louder than ever. The city continued to move around her, unaware of the loss that had just occurred. And in that moment, Jiwon understood. Some things, no matter how much you long for them, could never be fixed. Time and distance had done their work, and the silence between them had become the final boundary, one that even death could not erase.